Hello, my name is Sabrina Lamb, and welcome to Planet Wekeza, which means save and invest in Swahili. The mission in Planet Wekeza and Wekeza.com is to provide multilingual financial education and global access to investing in U.S. publicly traded companies. In addition to, or including with, our financial education mission is to understand that financial education, financial security is part of not only our culture as well as the foundation towards our long-term generational support as well as security. So here on this platform, I interview experts from professors to entrepreneurs that can really drive home not only the urgency of this mission, that your own financial security is important, but also to deepen your understanding in the historic ramifications of what's happening and why it is happening. So today, I have the absolute honor of speaking with Professor Justene Hill Edwards. She is, and I have damaged her book, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedman's Bank Saving and Trust. Welcome, Professor Edwards.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, for having me. And I love to see the marked up copy of the book.
I have to tell you, this was an absolutely riveting read. It's a page turner. Yes, everyone, you can get the book everywhere, but we're going to take you through this journey and how it relates to now and how it absolutely relates to you in your interaction with financial institutions and or governments. But first, I want to know, Professor Edwards, what is your why? Why did you spend countless hours in detailed research to create this miracle of research?
No, thank you for that. Well, I think my motivations for writing this book came from a few places. One is kind of my hat and my identity as a historian. As I was going through graduate school, doing training in African American history and training to be a historian of slavery, part of that training, of course, is learning about the history of the Civil War and the history of Reconstruction. And I had read a little bit about the Freedman's Bank, but not much. And so when I was finishing my PhD in 2015 and in 2016, kind of starting to think about turning the work that I was doing into my first book and thinking about what I may want to do for my second book, this is around the time when the Treasury Department approved of erecting a plaque on the facade of the Treasury Annex. And so that plaque kind of briefly details the history of the Freedmen's Bank. And so kind of going back and thinking about the Freedmen's Bank, I started to do as many scholars do. They kind of go and look at what other scholars and historians have written about the particular topic. And I was surprised that in 2016, there were only two other books about the Freedmen's Bank, one published in 1976 and the other one published in 1924. And there were a handful of scholarly journal articles, but I was surprised at the fact that there wasn't more work done on the Freedmen's Bank. And so that was one part. The other part is that I consider myself to be a historian of Black economic life in America. And so kind of pairing that with studying the histories of slavery, I saw that the history of the Freedmen's Bank could be really instructive in helping me understand the longer trajectory of topics that continue to have political significance today, the racial wealth gap, the kind of talking about racial economic inequality. And so I thought that studying this period of Reconstruction when slavery ends, and studying that through the history of the Freedmen's Bank would be a really interesting way to better understand these longer conversations about wealth and racial inequality that we continue to have in America today.
Right. So let's have another person or spirit join this conversation.
Sure.
Think about the Black people, the newly freed Black people who sat through presentations by different people, historical figures, and we'll talk about who they are, and
Mhm.
asked very, very astute questions in terms how safe will our money be?
Mhm.
He was referred to as an old man. Let's call him John.
Sure.
Mr. John, let's have him here
Mhm.
because the spirits of our ancestors still live with us today. And there's a lot of, what do you call it, repetition or the continuing narratives that happened during this time in the 1800s, everyone, that still continue today. So someone is continuing the story, and I want to lift them up.
Mhm.
So the Black people are newly freed,
Mhm.
okay? And so then they're trying to navigate what does this freedom mean and how they can have some security, some access to not politically, but also access to land. But then they were also trying to figure out, particularly those who served in the Union Army, trying to find out where do I save, where does my money, how can I keep my money safe? And many gave their money to the generals or whomever they were serving with to hold their money. Could you
Mhm.
talk about how coming out of slavery and then kind of peaked back up with Reconstruction,
Yeah.
but how Black people navigated managing, earning and managing their money as newly freed people?
Sure. Well, I mean, important part of this story is that so the Freedmen's Bank was established on March 3rd, 1865. And part of this kind of longer story of the history of the Freedmen's Bank and the African American depositors was that um, the Freedmen's Bank was kind of evolved out of the establishment of three military savings banks for Black soldiers in 1864. And so essentially, Black soldiers were serving in the Union Army and they were making money, sometimes on par with their white counterparts. And they were struggling with not really what to do with their money, but how to keep their money safe. Many of them wanted to send their money back to their wives and children, and so we have three Union generals established three military savings banks for Black soldiers, one in Norfolk, Virginia, one in Beaufort, South Carolina, and one in New Orleans, Louisiana. And so these military savings banks were actually fairly successful, such that by December of 1864, the two military banks in Norfolk and in Beaufort had accrued about $200,000 in Black soldiers' pay, which was kind of outstanding. And so what these banks showed to white Northerners, and what they showed to kind of the banking interests in the country at this time, was that African Americans were an untapped market, an untapped consumer for financial services. And what this showed, I think, what it kind of showed for African Americans was that they were coming out of this period of slavery into this new but kind of unstable period of freedom with an economic power. But this was not surprising to them. And this is what I talk about in my first book on free markets, where I look at the economic and financial activities of the enslaved in South Carolina. And what I show there is that African Americans, especially those who were enslaved, had been developing ideas of money, of finance for generations. They were trading among themselves. They were selling goods to their enslavers and other poor whites. And so they were armed with particular understandings of money, of the benefits of savings. And these ideas were not new. And so African Americans came to the Freedman's Bank excited about saving money, excited about the prospect of saving enough money for what they really wanted and needed. One that was to relocate and to find members of their families. But importantly, secondly, was the opportunity to buy land. And so property ownership, land ownership was fundamentally important to African Americans as they were coming out of slavery into this new period of freedom. And they engaged with the Freedman's Bank to help them meet that goal.
Mhm. And this was led because the so-called opportunity with the Freedman's Bank was brought to their attention by a Christian minister,
Yep.
Alvord. Would you
Mm.
talk about his role in the raising awareness, the advocacy regarding the bank for the formerly enslaved to deposit their monies into this new institution that was just for them?
Mhm. Well, John Alvord was a white abolitionist minister from New Jersey. And in 1864, he was working as an attaché with the Union Army. And so during this period of time, he was taking the opportunity to speak to as many African Americans as possible. He wanted to know what their lives were like in slavery, and importantly, he wanted to know kind of their goals and aspirations for this new period of freedom. And so overwhelmingly, they told him that they wanted access to land and the opportunity to buy land and buy property. And so he took this idea of creating a savings bank for African Americans because he saw the success of these three military savings banks. And so in January of 1865, he travels to New York and he gathers a group of white abolitionists, politicians, philanthropists, bankers, and he introduces the idea of creating the Freedman Savings and Trust Company to serve the financial needs of the nation's recently emancipated African Americans, the almost a million of whom were kind of, again, coming into this new period of freedom. And so this was a popular idea. He gained popular support from, again, some of the nation's most important bankers and philanthropists in the North. They traveled to DC shortly thereafter and gained congressional approval for this bank. And so on March 3rd, 1865, Lincoln signs the Freedmen's Bank Act, and it is seen as being kind of Lincoln's gift to African Americans in this new period of freedom, creating a savings bank just for them.
Hmm. Okay, so he went and he started to gather other trustees. Most of them were white Northerners, they were wealthy and
Mhm.
so forth. Was the initial intention of the foundation or the founding of the bank truly philanthropic?
Yeah, I mean, it was established as a benevolent financial institution. And the Freedman's Bank was not the first bank created under this idea. The 19th century saw the establishment of savings banks created by white philanthropists, especially in cities like Philadelphia and New York and Boston, to help the poor members of those cities kind of save money to help themselves get out of poverty. And so the idea of creating a savings bank for African Americans was kind of founded under this idea of safe savings banking being a cure for poverty. The Freedman's Bank, though, was established as a simple savings bank. It was established to only receive deposits of former slaves, to invest a third of those deposits in government securities, and so a very kind of low risk financial product. And the Freedman's Bank was supposed to operate with the least amount of risk possible, again, to protect the financial interests of African Americans. And so the fact that the Freedman's Bank was so popular and grew relatively quickly, especially in its first 5 years, was a testament to those benevolent foundations, but also to the economic power of African Americans as, again, they were coming out of slavery, such that in the first 3 years, by 1868, African Americans had put about $3.5 million into their bank accounts, which is, again, staggering. Today, that would be about $76.1 million. And again, I think it's so fascinating and so important that we're talking about a population of recently emancipated African Americans who are putting millions of dollars into these bank accounts collectively.
If you could also share the financial behaviors of African Americans during that time in the 1800s vis-a-vis their bank accounts. Did they make those deposits for long-term savings, or did they kind of use it sort of like a checking or a debit to save enough money and then to go and purchase land, for example?
Sabrina, that's such an important topic and question, because that fundamentally was a misalignment between African Americans and the bank's white administrators. African Americans were using the Freedman's Bank and putting money in their bank accounts to keep their money safe for a short period of time, because what they really wanted to do was save enough money, withdraw that money, and buy land, buy machinery, buy livestock. That's really what they wanted the bank to help them do, simply to save money for a short period of time. The bank's white administrators wanted African Americans to put their money in the bank and essentially keep it there to allow for the bank's investment in securities to pay off. And so essentially, there became clear that there was a misalignment between what the bank's white administrators wanted African Americans to do with their money, which was leave it in the bank, versus what African Americans wanted to do, which was to make money, to earn money, to put money in their bank accounts and then withdraw it when they had enough to buy land. And so that was a very early kind of reflection of the ways in which the African American depositors and white bank administrators were really misaligned in terms of their goals.
And the other misalignment was the paternalism that you talk about, because in the 1800s, Black people were demanding to have some. Can we have Black cashiers in the bank, in the
Yeah.
branches? Why can't we work here? Or why can't we be a treasurer here? Could you share what you deemed as a paternalistic approach to the Black depositors and their accounts and the
Sure.
bank?
Well, African Americans were really not involved in the bank's administration, both kind of in the board of trustees or kind of running individual bank branches. And that became a problem. The first Black trustees didn't join the board until 1867, and they weren't really as involved in the bank's kind of administration or operation. And increasingly, African Americans wanted to see Black cashiers, Black bank managers in their branches. And there was kind of pushback from white bank administrators saying that, like, I'm not sure if we can really trust African Americans to run these bank branches. And so that was also a misalignment. There subsequently became more branch cashiers after the 1870s. Specifically, one of the more prominent Black cashiers was in New Orleans, and he was a biracial Black man named C.S. Salvin.
Right.
And so he was one of the more prominent of the Black cashiers.
Mhm.
But there have been kind of conversations among scholars calling the Freedman's Bank a Black bank, and this is kind of one of the reasons why I don't believe that it was. Because first and foremost, a majority of the bank's berators and administrators and managers were white.
Charlie McKinney asked, did the philanthropists and abolitionists really want financial freedom for Black people?
Mm.
But they wanted the Black votes, though. They wanted their money. Okay.
Well, I think it's a good question, right? And the idea of the Freedman's Bank as being a philanthropic venture, I think, was really important. I think the reality was that the majority of the bank's administrators, the bank's white administrators, were involved in the bank's management because they liked the idea of being involved in it, not because they were necessarily really supportive of the bank kind of growing and expanding and ultimately benefiting African Americans. And that was part of the bank's fundamental problem. Because the bank's administrators, even members of Congress, I don't think took seriously enough the fact that African Americans were really enthusiastic about patronizing this bank, about putting their hard-earned savings into their bank accounts. They took their investment and their involvement in the bank incredibly seriously, and I don't think that the bank's white administrators took their involvement as seriously as African Americans did.
As well as you write in research in the book, Congress didn't even take their oversight seriously.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of words that are really important I want everyone to hang on that Professor and Dr. Edwards shared. She talked about the role of the bank, the Freedman's Bank was a savings bank. And we're going to
Mm.
pivot on that. But also where the oversight was not, there was no regulatory oversight that is kind of common here, but sometimes there's some
Yeah.
missteps. But if you
Yeah.
could address that, please.
Sure. Well, we're kind of operating in a period of time when the first financial regulator was created. And so the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency was established in February of 1863. And the comptroller was made responsible for kind of regulating national banks and kind of forcing the transition of state banks to a national banking framework and kind of solidifying the use of one currency. Prior to this, banks could issue their own currencies, which was kind of like a crazy renegade period in American history in terms of American finance. And so the comptroller was supposed to be made responsible for regulating the Freedman's Bank. However, when Congress approved of creating the bank and when Lincoln signed the bank into existence, the Freedmen's Bank was not under the jurisdiction of the comptroller. Instead, the Congress was supposed to regulate and therefore examine the bank. And I think that that was a really important distinction. And it kind of goes back to my previous comment in that I don't think that members of Congress were really taking seriously the fact that one, the bank would grow so quickly, and that two, African Americans would put so much money in their bank accounts. I think if they had taken African American participation in the Freedmen's Bank as seriously as they should have, then they would have shifted regulation and examination to the comptroller sooner than they did.
And according to the bank's charter, and
Mhm.
everyone, this is so important, the foundation of this institution and any institution. According to the bank's charter, there were not to be any loans of depositors' money particularly by the trustees.
Yes. Exactly, exactly. I will answer a question. The FDIC was not yet created. And so the fact that the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency was really the first and the major regulator here was important. But yes, I mean, it is fascinating that we are talking about a period too where banking is still in this renegade period. There's not a lot of regulation. In many ways, corruption was seen as kind of a part of doing business in this period. And so the Freedman's Bank was kind of open to plunder because of the sheer structure of banking in this period. But according to the bank's original charter, the bank was not supposed to make loans because, of course, it was a savings bank, and loan making was seen as being incredibly risky, which it was. And so that's why when the Freedman's Bank charter was established, no lending was supposed to happen under the regulations outlined by Congress and signed by Lincoln.
However, because they had lobbied Congress and these were their friends and so forth, that may have been another reason. But they were going all across the country. Well, I don't know about all across the country, but in the North and the South, and then ads for the Freedmen's Bank would appear in Black newspapers. For
Mhm.
example, the Freedman Saving Bank, come one, come all, and deposit your money in one among the best institutions in the United States, and thereby save your money and get the interest. So wrote the colored Tennessean,
Yes.
May 24th, 1866.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, the bank's marketing strategy was direct and it was aggressive. The bank's administrators were advertising in some of the most prominent Black newspapers in the South and in the North and Mid-Atlantic. And they were very strategic in the language that they used, saying to forego tobacco and forego liquor and fancy clothing and jewelry, and instead put your money in your Freedman's bank account. To um, a penny saved is a penny earned, or if you put this amount of money in your Freedman's bank account now, it will grow to be this amount of money in 2 years. This was one of the best institutions that Lincoln supported in the aftermath of the war. That to be fully participating citizens in this American republic, you will embrace the responsibility of banking and saving. And so connecting participation in the Freedmen's Bank to citizenship, especially in this new period of freedom, was incredibly important for the bank's administrators. And increasingly, it was incredibly convincing to African Americans who began to really absorb these messages. And even men like Frederick Douglass were publicly supportive of the bank for this reason, because he believed that if African Americans could show their fiscal responsibility, that white Americans would be more accepting of their inclusion in the body politic, which was a message that ultimately did not yield the type of results that he hoped, unfortunately.
And unfortunately, his support may have been less so if he knew what was happening, how fragile the finances were
Yeah.
behind the scenes. Okay, so the Union, the Civil War has kind of ended, and then this whole issue, and throughout generations, Black families talk about the 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah.
Would you please address this, because it's my view that there was a kind of a promise, but it was for the formerly enslaved people in about 3 states:
Mhm.
Georgia, South Carolina, and maybe one another. But it was an order that
Mhm.
was issued. And then what happened to that order to
Mm.
give those formerly enslaved land? So we can put this 40 acres and a mule
Mhm.
promise with just some more transparency, I think.
Sure, sure, sure. Well, it is called Special Field Order number 15, and it was signed into law by Union General William T. Sherman. And it was created to provide land to the formerly enslaved between South Carolina and northern Florida. And so this order was supposed to provide 400,000 acres of prime coastal land to the formerly enslaved for a few reasons. One, to kind of help them begin this new period of freedom with land. Two, to encourage former Confederates to defect because Sherman was giving this land that was formerly owned by Confederates to the formerly enslaved. And three, importantly, Sherman was not doing this out of some moral compulsion, right? He was actually very violent towards communities of African Americans. When he would kind of go through these communities in the Confederate South, there would be thousands of African Americans formerly enslaved who would follow him in his army. And he did not like that. And so he was trying to separate them, to segregate them from white soldiers as they were kind of marching through the South on their military campaign. And so Special Field Order number 15 was to kind of separate African Americans from whites in the South at this point. But what it did for African Americans was it provided them with 40-acre plots of land. And it was supposed to, again, help them in this new period, in this transition to freedom. Now, subsequently, when Lincoln was assassinated and President Andrew Johnson kind of arises into this role as president, in the fall of 1865, he rescinds it. And African Americans are divested of this land. And so 1865 in this period is so important for African Americans because we see this great promise of freedom, this great promise of land, but it is almost immediately rescinded once Johnson comes into president that fall.
And President Johnson also forgave pardon. Where does that
Yes.
word come up? Pardon the former Confederate
Yes.
soldiers and
Mhm.
gave the land back to them
Yes.
after the black people had been promised and were
Mhm.
starting to build their lives on that land. And
Mhm.
was it Alfred or who visited Ediston Island and met with a community of black people? We're talking 1800s, everyone.
I believe it was Saxton who was at this point the Secretary of War. Mhm.
To explain that's not going to happen.
Yes, and so he goes to South Carolina and he meets with communities of African Americans, and he is given the responsibility of telling them that they no longer have legal claims to this land. And I even think he realized what a challenging responsibility he had, right? Because he had kind of witnessed African Americans building communities on this land, and so he's kind of forced to give out this horrible news. And of course, African Americans are upset. They're angry because we might even say that the land was an initial form of reparations for generations of violence, of forced labor, of family separation, and so this period is again a period of great promise, but great tragedy because African Americans are experiencing this new period of freedom, but really not having the direct support of the federal government in making their claims to freedom in these very tangible ways, which is land.
And as we entered the Reconstruction era, and
Mhm.
as Black people were supporting the Freedmen's Bank, they experienced widespread violence in response because of white fears and anger to their exercising or determination to exercise their economic rights.
Absolutely. In states like Louisiana and Texas, there were dramatic upticks of racial violence where white Americans and former Confederates were taking out their frustrations with losing the war on African Americans themselves. And so we see these moments of essentially race riots where white Americans are terrorizing Black communities in this period. And so while I might say that the history of the Freedmen's Bank is could be seen as a one of promise, right? African Americans really displaying and demonstrating their economic fitness for freedom. They're also under the constant fear of white violence in this period, and that violence continues past Reconstruction into the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay, let's go back to the office, back to the because Alfred, because he was Minister Alvord. Am I pronouncing his name correctly? Alvord.
Alvord.
So Minister Alvord was saying, I'm under a lot of stress trying to manage all my professional responsibilities.
Yes.
I think we should move the bank from New York, and it was on Cedar Street, everyone, from Cedar Street to Washington, D.C., and
Yes.
we also need to recruit some new trustees.
Yes.
Where did how did Jay and Henry Cook figure into all of this history?
Sure. Well, 1867, 2 years into the bank's operation, was a very important year. Prior to this, the bank's main office was in New York, and that's because that's where the majority of the trustees lived and worked. But Alvord, who again was the bank's founder, at this point, I think he's the second vice president of the bank. He introduces the idea of moving the Freedmen's Bank main office from New York to DC. He says that it means that the bank will be closer to a broader hub of African Americans, but importantly, closer to Congress and the federal government. And so he gets approval for this, but around the same time, it's really in the spring of 1867 when this happens. A handful of board members drop off, and Alvord introduces a new crop of trustees who will fundamentally change the bank's operational structure. The most important of whom was Henry Cook. Now, Henry Cook was a banker. He and his brother Jay Cook ran the most valuable and important investment firm, the first investment firm in America, Jay Cook and Company. And at the time, Henry Cook was the president of First National Bank, which was the DC branch of Jay Cook and Company. Now, Henry Cook was incredibly well connected. He and his brother were. They were close personal friends with Lincoln because during the war, they together had raised about $1 billion for the war effort. And at this time, they became incredibly wealthy. They were also close personal friends with Treasury Secretary and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon P. Chase. They were also friends with Grant, who would become president in 1870. And so they were very tightly connected, well connected to many of the major political and economic players in the nation at this period of time. And so when he joins the Board of Trustees in the spring of 1867, he brings a cohort of men with him who support his financial and political goals. The most important of which was to begin to lobby members of Congress to change the bank's charter. So again, the bank is a savings bank. It's not supposed to make loans. Henry Cook believes that he and his business partners could potentially benefit financially if the bank started to make loans, because he saw millions of dollars of African Americans' money just sitting in bank accounts. Interestingly enough, it is around the same time that the bank makes its first illegal loan. And so on April 19th, 1867, a man named D.L. Eaton takes a loan for $1,000.
Cook's friend.
Yes, Cook's friend.
Who became the board of, he was a member of the Board of Trustees brought in by Cook.
Yes.
Okay. And yeah, so he was recruited, so to speak, by
Mhm.
Cook because, as you write in the book,
Mm,
because Cook thought or may have thought, well, he's not going to challenge anything.
exactly.
Right.
And he could potentially benefit from being in this position.
And
So
did.
and did. And
Mhm.
so Eaton takes the first loan, $1,000. It's an illegal loan. He pays it back, but importantly, 2 weeks later, he signs on to be the bank's actuary, which is the person who is supposed to evaluate the risk profile of the bank's investment portfolio. And so I say that it is only 2 years into the bank's operation that corruption really starts to seep in. And from there, the bank makes almost $100,000 in illegal loans between 1867 and when Congress actually approves of amending the bank's charter in May of 1870. And importantly, Henry Cook is the chairman of the Finance Committee, which was the committee on the Board of Trustees responsible for maintaining the bank's investments. And so it is in this period, only 2 years after the bank begins operation, that the bank makes a legal loan, shifts its main office, brings on trustees who are really interested in kind of chipping away at the bank's benevolent and philanthropic foundations, and that's exactly what happens.
And according to your detailed research in the book, they knew, most people close to that knew the fragile financial position that the bank was in at that time. But
Mhm.
the bank trustees, led by Cook, thought it would be a great idea to buy land in
Yes.
Washington to build a new cathedral gold,
Yes.
trim building in Washington. In fact, the New York Times wrote at that time in the 1800s, please tell us what year that was, said, this is a crazy idea.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
paraphrasing, okay?
Yes, yes, I believe it was in 1869 or 1870.
Yeah.
The bank's board of trustees buys a fabulous new building. It was adjacent to the White House and Treasury, which was important, and so it was prime real estate. And they spend $260,000 on the renovations. They spare no expense. There's beautiful furniture. They use black walnut and marble. Frederick Douglass writes that he is astounded at how opulent the building was. But what it meant was that the bank's white trustees were prioritizing what the bank looked like, while the bank's black depositors really didn't care about what the bank's main office looked like. They wanted to make sure that their money was safe. And so again, we see the bank's white administrators really start to not chip away by this point, but hammer away at the bank's philanthropic foundations.
That's right. And then they continued to make those kind of so-called loans. The trustees would loan their friends, like, oh,
Yep.
Bob, I don't know if there was a Bob during that time. Bob, do
Sure.
you need a loan? And they
Robert,
would,
I'm sure.
Robert, okay. Robert, do you need a loan? And they would give these loans, but the black depositors with their own money face far more denials or reviews,
Mhm.
than the white loan applicants.
Yes. I mean, it became it got to a point where African Americans were really questioning why they couldn't get loans, and they knew that the DC branch was giving out millions of dollars in loans to white borrowers who had personal or professional ties and connections to the bank's white members of the board of trustees. And so we are talking about Henry Cook taking out at least $500,000 in loans from the bank. We're talking about the bank's architect getting loans from the bank. Interestingly, though, Howard University got about $125,000 in loans negotiated by Howard's founder, General O. Howard. Howard and Alvord had become very close in 1865 and 1866 because they worked together at the Freedmen's Bureau. And so It is kind of fascinating, the kind of network of businessmen, of politicians who were getting loans from the bank, while a very, very small percentage of that loan volume went to African Americans. And we're talking about mostly Black churches and institutions in and around DC. But I mean, in the grand scheme of things, we find out that by 1874, when the bank collapses, about 95% of the loan volume went to whites in and around DC, which meant that only about 5% went to African Americans, and those were essentially a handful of Black churches.
Looks like you have a former student missing your classes these days.
Oh, I wonder who this is.
Are these monetary values you're citing adjusted for today's inflation? She does.
Yes, that is in the book. And so one of the figures that I cite quite regularly is that by 1874, African Americans had put about $57 million in the bank. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be about $1.5 billion.
Mhm. Did the bank grow too fast at its heyday? How many states or cities was it located in, and did it grow too fast?
Yes, I think it did grow too fast for a variety of reasons. But at its heyday, at its height, by 1872, there were 37 branches across 17 states, and so we have as far north as New York and Philadelphia, as far south as Tallahassee, Florida, and as far west as St. Louis, Missouri. There were, interestingly, proposed branches in Texas, in Houston, and in Galveston. But at the time, specifically in 1866 and 67, the bank's white administrators said that they could not establish branches there because of the rise of racial violence in those two places. And so the bank actually could have spread out more, but we also do need to account for, this is still a period of racial violence and clashes, especially in the former Confederate South. But the bank spread fairly quickly, such that by March of 1866, there were about 19 branches, which was kind of astounding, right? And the problem was that the bank's administrators were not being judicious about how they were spending depositors' money. Instead of renting bank branch buildings, they were buying buildings outright.
Right.
They were not necessarily training the bank's cashiers. Um,
Or
and
paying the cashiers.
Yes, and so there were kind of back and forth between how much cashiers would be paid based on kind of where the branches were. And so the bank spread very quickly. And so while African Americans were continuing to put lots of millions of dollars in the bank, the bank's administrators were not being as judicious as they should have been. And kind of throwing into this, the bank's main office was lending millions of dollars. And so we are talking about a situation that could have been helped if there was perhaps a regulator to do its job. But the first examination actually does not happen until February of 1873. And that's when Congress mandates that the comptroller send out examiners to examine the Freedman's Bank. And what the examiner finds is that the bank is essentially insolvent. um, uh, Branch cashiers are really not being trained as well as they should have been. The bank's finance committee is not doing its due diligence in terms of making sure that the loans that they do make have adequate collateral. And so the bank is insolvent, it's upside down, and financially it is really not doing well.
We're coming up on time, but if you could just address this issue, how pivotal was it towards the bank's collapse of those investments in railroads by Henry and J. Cook?
Mhm. Well, I mean, this is a period of time when the federal government and private investors are investing millions of dollars into the construction of a transcontinental railroad, and one of those projects was the Northern Pacific Railroad. And so the Cook brothers were made responsible for raising capital for this project, and they were having a hard time. They couldn't find investors both domestically and internationally in Western Europe. And so what happens is that in the beginning of 1873, they start to prepare for bankruptcy. That subsequently happens in September of 1873, and it sparks what's called the Panic of 1873, which is a financial depression. And so what do depositors do? They make runs on their bank branches, because they want their money. And so, as we know too, I mean, runs on bank kind of increases the level of instability, because most banks don't have that much capital or cash, right? They send their money to the main branch or invested or what have you. And so this kind of, again, continues to chip away at the bank. And so the failure of this railroad project kind of pushes the Freedman's Bank further to insolvency. And that is essentially what happens with the second comptroller examination in February of 1874. It is an even more damning examination, and that is made public. And so by this time, John Alvord is the bank's president. He becomes the bank's president in 1868. A small but vocal group of trustees start to push him out and say that he's really not done a good job. He's allowed for the Cook brothers to come and pillage the bank. And so John Alvord resigns. And then in March of 1874, they ask and invite Frederick Douglass to be the bank's last president. He says yes. He becomes the president. He looks at the bank's finances and realizes that they're upside down and that the bank is completely insolvent. And he is entering this position to essentially be the president of the Freedman's Bank when it fails. And that's exactly what happens on July 2nd, 1874.
So in order to find out, were the Black depositors, of course, they got their money back. And what happened to? Well, no, you can't answer. You can't answer, Professor Cook. All right, because Professor Cook, Professor Edwards. And of course, Henry and Jay Cook, they all went to prison, or did they? What happened, and why was Frederick Douglass brought in, and what was his response to it? But I do want you to. They have to read the book.
Yes.
Okay.
You're gonna have to read the book.
Yours looks prettier than mine. So, the final question here on Planet Wekeza, and thank you for being here, Professor Dr. Justene Hill Edwards. How does this issue, this emotion regarding trust, permeate our community from the time we've set on the shores of North America? Mm-hmm. How and why does it continue to permeate as it relates to our feeling towards government institutions and financial institutions, and what can we do today because you have to keep your money safe. We do have the FDIC now.
Yeah.
How should Black America and Black people throughout the African diaspora feel about engaging and trusting financial institutions?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that I think we have to understand that we have to be proper stewards of our money, but that's not new. It's not like African Americans and people of African descent need to be told that. We know that. And so I often think that much of the conversations about financial inclusion and the racial wealth gap put a disproportionate amount of responsibility on Black communities, without taking into consideration the historical and generational injustices that the financial services industry has waged on Black communities. And it is an inherited and generational trauma that I think we are not talking about quite enough. I think that, yes, financial literacy is incredibly important. But I think one of the lessons of the Freedmen's Bank was that African Americans were doing everything that they were supposed to do. The recently emancipated were doing everything that they were supposed to do. They were working, they were earning wages, they were saving, they were buying property, they were trying to protect their property and their families, and they still were not protected. And so this is why there is a disproportionate lack of trust in traditional financial institutions. I think that the work that you are doing is so instrumental in kind of teaching our community, both here and internationally, that that we have this economic power, and this is what we need to do with it. We need to be proper stewards of our own financial future. And so I think that understanding where that distrust comes from and really appreciating it too, right? Like African Americans, people of color, people of African descent, perhaps disproportionately don't trust traditional finance and traditional banks for specific reasons. Um, and to, I think, appreciate that is incredibly important, but still figuring out ways to build up our own communities financially is incredibly important.
Thank you. How can everyone reach you? Where can everyone purchase the book?
You can purchase Savings and Trust at your local booksellers or online. And you can find me at JusteneHillEdwards.com.
Professor and Dr. Justene Hill Edwards, author of The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank Savings and Trust. Thank you so much for joining me here on Planet Wekeza.
Thank you for having me, Sabrina.